Hello, welcome to the New York School of Design Sewing Basics course. And once again, I'm Hannah Noth, and I'm going to be guiding you and instructing you throughout this series. Let's move on to pleats. Pleats are really simple to sew as it's just repetition. You're going to be doing the same thing over and over again. Very similar to darts, however, the key part of sewing accurate and identical pleats is to accurately transfer markings from your pattern to your fabric. It will make your life so much easier when you're pinning, and there won't be any guesswork. Truly, the most time-consuming part of sewing pleats are the markings being transferred from the pattern to the fabric and the pinning. The sewing itself is a simple straight seam and goes extremely quickly. So let's start with transferring our markings from our pattern to our fabric. Now, if I were to measure this pattern, these are going to be 1 1/4 inch seams. And as you'll see, there's arrows from every seam on this pattern. So let's take a closer look for a moment. You see, there's an arrow from this short line, looking like a notch, to this line. The width in between these arrows is your pleat. The arrow indicates that you are going to fold over from this line to that line to create the pleat. All these pleats will be going in the same direction, to the right. What I'm going to do in order to start marking these pleats is I'm going to make sure that my fabric is pinned very accurately to the pattern piece. Okay, now I'm going to begin by marking my pleats. Once again, there's a couple of ways you could do this. You could use a disappearing ink pen, like I'm about to do again, or you could use chalk, as I mentioned previously, or a third option in the case of these pleats, because you only need a small marking at the top of your fabric, is you could snip it with fabric scissors. Similar to a notch, you could use fabric scissors to just snip a little bit into the pattern piece to indicate the pleat. I'm going to go ahead and use my invisible ink pen once again to mark the notches. I am not going to transfer the arrows because I already know what direction the pleats are supposed to go. So I'm just going to start at this side of the pattern piece and very carefully mark directly below the notch on the fabric. And see, now I have all of these little markings at the very top of my fabric. It's time to begin folding the pleats. I can see here, it's easy to distinguish which markings are the pleats and which are the space in between. The shorter distance in between dots is the space in between pleats, and the wider one, the 1 1/4 width ones, are for the pleats. So let's start over at the left. I'm going to take this first notch and I'm going to fold it over to meet the second notch. Now I have 3 layers of fabric together, creating one fold, which will turn into a pleat very shortly. I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to pin it perpendicular to the edge of the fabric so it'll be easier to take out later. Okay, that's one pleat that's been pinned. A little bit of a tongue twister there. Let's move on to the next one. I'm going to take this notch, bring it over to the next notch, and pin. As you can see, this is going to take a lot of pins. But see how perfectly marked that pattern was with the distance in between the pleats? As you'll see, they now lie side by side perfectly. with no excess and no shortage of fabric in between. I'm going to continue making my markings. Match those up and pin. You'll notice that the fabric begins to get a lot shorter the more that I pin the pleats. So anytime that you're drafting a pattern for pleats, you need to make sure you add a lot of width. It's going to be a really wide pattern piece regardless of what type of pleats, because they take up a lot of fullness of the fabric. Okay, look at all those pins. Now we're ready to sew our pleats. I like to add one additional seam at the top of your pleat. This means that my pleats will stay in place without the need of pins, and then your pleats will be ready to sew to another part of your garment after you've sewn the actual pleats, because you would never just stop at this step when you're creating a garment, right? You're always going to attach the pleats to something else. So that's why you always want to factor in your future seam allowance from the top of the fabric to the bottom, and make sure that the seam line holding your pleats together is narrower than your future seam allowance. In this case, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew the top of the pleats together. Very carefully taking out each pin right before I sew over it. And there you have it. Nice, even, uniform pleats, ready to finish off a sleeve, a skirt hem, or perhaps a ruffled top. The last step that you want to do with pleats is the same as darts. Definitely iron them. Always keep your iron handy when you're sewing any type of tuck. We'll iron our pleats all flat in the same direction, and that will finish them off so that they're ready to be sewn to the other part of your garment. And that's how you sew tucks, specifically pleats. I'll see you then.